Hi guys, I'm Reha and you're about to listen to a BBC Trending podcast. But before you do, just a heads up, it's only audio. Here's just another place to listen to the stuff we make. We're trying something new here. We hope you like it.
At the start of this programme, we often read out part of a post or play an audio clip from something that's gone viral online.
But we're not going to do that today. A week ago, 50 people were killed in attacks on mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. The main suspect left a document online and he live-streamed a video on Facebook.
Like many other news organisations, we're not going to play the video or quote from the document in much detail.
By now, you'll have heard a great deal about the attacks. But what we're going to do is try and examine the toxic online ideology that appears to have inspired this massacre and ask some questions about how those beliefs live and spread on extreme message boards.
And we'll try to find out more about what the big social media companies and the authorities are doing about it.
I'm Anisa Subedar.
And I'm Mike Wendling, and this is the BBC Trending podcast. We investigate online culture, including its dark underside.
Robert Evans is a reporter for the investigative site Bellingcat and an expert on extremists. He lives in the US, and on the 15th of March, he was just getting back from the gym when he heard the news of the attacks in New Zealand. He quickly went online.
I watched the video, which, I've been to Iraq a few times. I've seen some bad stuff, but that might be the worst thing I've ever seen.
The video he's talking about was a live stream that the killer put out on Facebook as he was carrying out the attacks. Facebook says they worked immediately to take it down. But once it appeared online, people made copies and started uploading those copies on Facebook, on YouTube, and on other websites.
There's a lot of people online who are talking about don't share the shooter's name, don't share his face, don't share his video. The shooter has already ensured that the audience he committed this massacre for and wrote his manifesto for have seen it all, and they will never not have access to the video.
In addition to that horrific footage, Robert started analysing the document the killer had put online. Now, some have called it a manifesto, but perhaps that gives it more gravitas than it actually deserves. It's a rambling, poorly written 74-page screed filled with internet jokes, pieces of online culture, and apparent misinformation.
The video and the document were targeted at hardcore online white nationalists who visit 4chan's poll board, short for politically incorrect. This is an extreme free speech message board where nearly anything goes. Over the past few years, it's been increasingly associated with the nationalist, racist alt-right. Just 10 to 20 minutes before the attack began, links to the video and the manifesto were posted on a related, even more extreme website called 8chan.
Robert Evans believes that this was the audience that the shooter wanted.
If you are someone who is extremely online, as I unfortunately am, and you spent time in the same sort of internet communities that I've spent time in, you recognize that the whole manifesto was essentially a series of jokes aimed at members of those communities.
Robert Evans wrote on the website Bellingcat that the so-called manifesto was a trap, quote, laid for journalists searching for the meaning behind this horrific crime.
So what did he mean by that? Well, let's take a few examples. The document includes an internet-famous joke, a piece of copy pasta, or a block of text that's been copied and pasted from elsewhere. It comes from a post ostensibly written by a US Navy SEAL who's acting tough, deadly and macho, but it's just a piece of fiction, a joke.
And a week ago online, people on 4chan and 8chan were gleefully predicting that journalists would credulously report everything in the document as true, and for instance report that the shooter had been in the US Navy.
Or that he was somehow linked to PewDiePie, the famous YouTuber, just because during the video he shouted, "Subscribe to PewDiePie." That's just a popular internet catchphrase. PewDiePie denounced the attacks, by the way.
But in his story, Robert Evans broke down all of the misinformation and joking in the document. And partly because of his work and the work of others, credulous, unthinking reporting on the manifesto didn't really happen.
I hope that is the start of a new trend and evidence that we're getting smarter. That's part of why I thought, because I didn't sleep that night. in order to get the article up as quickly as possible, because I knew that the most impact I could have on this horrible situation was to hopefully cut some of the steam out of this guy's sails.
So who are these extremists, and what do we know about the kind of people who hang out in these spaces online?
This is not the first time we've tackled this question on Trending. We've explored extremist social media movements of all types, and the alt-right has been on our radar for some time now.
We found a worldwide collection of people who are drawn to extreme message boards for all sorts of reasons. Some are pranksters who think trolling and harassment are a joke. Others are more overtly political. They're motivated by opposition to versions of feminism, or they're anti-immigration.
And lurking among them, often hiding in plain sight, are extremists with violent tendencies. We should explain one popular meme which demonstrates how some people with white nationalist sympathies try to mainstream their ideas and trick people who aren't in on their jokes and symbols, and how their layers of irony and misdirection allow them to operate without much restriction online.
When the alleged killer appeared in court after the attacks, he flashed the OK sign.
If you wonder what we're talking about, it goes something like this. It's a looped index finger and thumb, and the three other fingers are pointing outwards.
You'll just have to imagine it. But anyway, this is a completely innocuous hand signal that's been used for centuries all over the world. Its meaning is straightforward and obvious. It means everything's fine, okay.
Now, for some reason, a few years ago, Donald Trump supporters began flashing it.
Then in early 2017, an anonymous post appeared on 4chan. Now, nearly all posts on 4chan are anonymous. But anyway, this one said something like this. We must flood Twitter with spam, claiming that the OK hand sign is a symbol of white supremacy. The stated goal of the prank was to trick, quote, leftists into condemning this everyday gesture.
So what's interesting here is that to a degree, it worked. Some people on Twitter and Tumblr and other social networks started condemning people who use the OK symbol, calling them white nationalists. But at the same time, some white nationalists and fascists did really adopt the gesture as a sign of their ideology.
The prank was meant to create confusion, and it kind of did. I was recently asked straight up whether the OK symbol is a white supremacist gesture. And I just had to say that it depends on context. Mostly, no. But, for instance, if the person flashing it is in front of a court after deadly attacks at mosques, then yes.
You know, if you're allowed to interpret their words in whatever way you want and whatever way is true to you, then you don't feel as intimidated to, join those groups or to be more engaging with those groups.
This is Hussein Kesvani, who is the UK editor of Mel, an online men's magazine. He says that this coded language, filled with double meanings, draws in disaffected young men, and they are mostly men, and also gives cover for extremists.
If you're an individual who, is looking for a community, if you're looking for people, because a lot of these guys are just really lonely, or a lot of these people are really lonely, right? They spend a lot of time online for a reason. You know, how does that lead us to a right-wing space? Well, actually, this is a tactic that the right wing have always used, right? They prey on lonely people, especially lonely men. They say that, society, mainstream society doesn't understand you, but we do.
4chan was founded in 2003. It wasn't initially meant to provide a safe space for white supremacists. It has, however, been overrun in recent years by extremists. The journalist Robert Evans explains that transformation.
The DNA of these groups was formed in that early 2000s period when, very much the attitude was nothing that happens here matters. And that's part of why a lot of the neo-Nazism that has infected these dark corners of the internet started as a joke. It started as people wanting to sort of tell Holocaust jokes and tell Nazi jokes and thinking that stuff was funny. And over time, through just the sheer rate of exposure to it, it becomes more serious.
I sort of was aware that something was kind of happening. This was around 2015, that these sites their political rhetoric was changing and becoming kind of more networked and more unified. And I think what I was kind of witnessing was the nascent alt-right.
Annie Kelly is a researcher at the University of East Anglia in England who's been studying right-wing extremist groups online.
She says that not all of the people drawn to extreme message boards like 4chan come from the fringes of society.
Most of the people I've spoken to have a university education. Most kind of come from middle-class backgrounds.
Annie Kelly told me that a key motivating factor for extremists is a conspiracy theory which essentially states that there's some grand plan to eliminate the white race or replace white people in Western countries. They use statistics about low birth rates in Western countries to instill fear.
Birth rates are a really common point of anxiety for the alt-right. I first heard this being discussed under a kind of conspiracy theory which was called white genocide. That later got updated to the Great Replacement, which I think is what the shooter titled his manifesto, to give it some more academic sounding credence, essentially. The conspiracy theory suggests that there is a kind of, that sort of immigration rates and falling white birth rates are essentially a deliberate plot to replace white people in what white nationalists and the alt-right would refer to as their own countries.
One of the aspects of that theory is the idea that there is one proper role for women, and that is to stay in the home and breed children.
There's a real longing in a lot of this writing about an undoing of modernity itself, about undoing the cause of women and women's rights, and returning to this conservative 1950s kind of, and crucially, all-white society. Essentially, the idea is that feminism, alongside a kind of more growing kind of liberal consensus, has given women this degree of power which they feel is morally incorrect but also actually destructive to society. So they essentially kind of project these kind of personal resentments that they have towards women into a kind of coherent political ideology.
Coming up, we explore a bigger question being asked about the role of social media companies in the aftermath of the Christchurch shootings. This week, we're looking at the social media tactics of extremists like the Christchurch shooter and how messages like his spread online. The big social media companies have faced a wave of criticism for the way the shooting video was disseminated. Could they have done more?
Now, at the start, we mentioned that the attack was live-streamed on Facebook. A link to the Facebook video was posted about 10 or 20 minutes before the attack started on an extreme message board, 8chan.
Facebook says fewer than 200 people watched it live. Another 4,000, they say, saw it shortly after. The first user report came in 12 minutes after the video had ended, 29 minutes after the attack had started.
Copies of the video spread rapidly on Facebook and other websites. The company said earlier this week that it had taken down 1.5 million uploads. YouTube said it took down tens of thousands of copies. They said the volume was, quote, unprecedented in both scale and speed. At times, there was a new upload to YouTube every second.
I spoke to Issie Lapowsky of Wired magazine, who's been tracking the spread of the video, and I asked why it was so difficult for big social media companies and their thousands of monitors to delete such a graphically violent piece of content.
They found it difficult because, frankly, it is very difficult. So in order to stop something like this, you have a live video where you don't know what's going to happen next. So the way that Facebook deals with live videos and moderating those live videos is it hopes that somebody will see something and say something, report it to one of their moderators around the world.
In general, Facebook, YouTube, and all the big social media companies don't review videos before they go online. They wait until posts are reported by other people using the networks.
But they do have the capacity to automatically delete videos using a process called hashing. This is like a digital fingerprint of a file. If there's a violent video that's been uploaded before, the companies can take a fingerprint or hash of it. And if someone tries to upload a video with the same digital fingerprint, it will be automatically deleted before anyone ever sees it.
Both Facebook and YouTube used these automated systems to stop uploads of the shooting video. Facebook says they stopped something like 1.2 million of them. There's only one problem.
Not every video gets picked up that way because people are pretty tricky about uploading these videos. They know how to evade some of these defenses that companies have put in place.
Issie Lapowsky says Facebook is coming under pressure not only because of the video, but because of other white nationalist content that is not taken down.
They're saying, we're doing our part, we're suspending millions of videos instantly, what more do you want from us? And I think the public is saying, we want you to never have any of these videos being shared. And furthermore, we don't want you to be the platforms that are sort of driving people to this extremism in the first place, as it appears that the Christchurch killer was driven to this extremism by a lot of the content he was consuming online because he knew these networks so very well.
And she says Facebook might have to rethink its offering of live video, which is a relatively new feature of the network.
You have to remember, before a few years ago, live video didn't exist. So there was a Facebook before live video. Facebook might have to come to terms with the fact that if they can't stop these videos from spreading and so many people are demanding that they do just that, then maybe that this is the product that is causing them more trouble than it's worth.
After the attacks, both Facebook and YouTube issued statements, and they said that extreme violent content has no place on their platforms. But this isn't the first time they've had to deal with a proliferation of extremist propaganda.
Well, we've seen a lot of similarities between the way that he conducted the two attacks in the two mosques with the way that ISIS conduct their attack, the Salafi jihadis conduct their attacks. I mean, even the way that it has been broadcasted live on Facebook.
Ali Soufan is a former FBI agent who was one of the first to warn about the threat of Al-Qaeda before the 9/11 attacks. He now runs an organisation that advises governments and companies on risk management and intelligence, and he puts at least some of the responsibility for tackling right-wing radicalisation on the big tech companies.
I would like to see more responsibility from them. So far, with everything that we're dealing with, from the Russian intervention in the election of 2016, or what happened with Brexit, or different elections in Europe, to terrorism from jihadis and ISIS, to now terrorism and hate narratives promoted by white supremacists and radical right, to fake news and conspiracy theories. Everything is connected today, unfortunately, to these platforms. And I think these platforms have responsibility to do more.
When I spoke to Ali Soufan, he also pointed out that the jihadist groups and the white nationalist groups both operate online in similar ways.
Also, at the same time, the issues that he was talking about, the revenge that he wanted to do, the feeling that the Western world and Europe is being extincted by foreigners and by outsiders, that's also very similar to the ideology and the narrative of groups like ISIS or like Al-Qaeda, where they advocate conducting violence in order to protect the Muslims around the world. We've seen very similar messaging that the right-wing extremists and right-wing terrorists are copying from the Salafi jihadis.
And after the Christchurch attacks, some more specific similarities were noticed by our colleagues at the Jihadist media team, part of BBC Monitoring.
At the same time that the video was being circulated on extreme message boards with white supremacist audiences, there were another group of extremists who were also using the attacks to spread propaganda. Abdirahim Saeed is part of the Jihadist media team.
In the immediate aftermath, a lot of extremist jihadist accounts on social media, and in particular we're talking about Telegram, they were sharing the graphic footage of the attack. For them, it was a golden opportunity to use it, to exploit it for their purposes. So they were saying, Muslims, look what is happening. We haven't been lying. There's always been a long-term struggle between Muslims and non-Muslims, a clash of civilizations. And here's the evidence. Look how your Muslim brothers and sisters are being killed.
Abdirahim mentioned a network there called Telegram. Now, this is an encrypted chat app, and we should note that it is also trying to clamp down on extremists. But these messages weren't being shared, by and large, on Facebook and on Twitter, because for years, the big social media companies have been taking down jihadist propaganda, following a wave of sometimes graphically violent videos emanating from the so-called Islamic State.
Clearly, there is a lot of resources going to getting rid of extremist jihadist content from mainstream social media websites, in particular Facebook and Twitter. We've been saying this for the last few years. So partly it's about the resources, it's about the will, it's about the understanding of how jihadist extremist content works, what are the words they're using, what are the hashtags they're using. So you could ask, has the same been done with the far-right extremist content? And a lot of analysts are saying there's been a blind spot there.
Abdirahim was focusing on jihadist content, but tackling far-right extremism might be more difficult.
Given the flexibility of language and the layers of meaning we've been talking about, there is a challenge in identifying and stopping extremist propaganda from white nationalists.
And what about the extremist material on 4chan and 8chan?
Internet service providers in both Australia and New Zealand have reportedly blocked the chans and other websites that were spreading the shooting video.
But journalist Robert Evans, who we heard from earlier, says that monitoring them rather than banning them is a much better strategy.
Law enforcement ought to be monitoring not just 8chan's poll board, but other similar communities online, and figuring out their names and figuring out where they live is a critical part of public safety.
And Ali Soufan, the former FBI agent who we spoke to, has a much broader suggestion.
I think what we need to do is first tackle the ideology, regardless if the ideology is coming from jihadis or white supremacists. Any ideology that advocates for hate, any ideology that advocates for violence and for murder, we need to tackle it, regardless to the groups. We need to start working with our allies in sharing information, sharing data, sharing expertise in order to identify that network and dismantle it.
That's it for this episode of the BBC Trending podcast. Our thanks to James Beard, who recorded and mixed this episode, and to our editor, Jeremy Skeet.
What did you think? Well, you can let us know via Twitter, via YouTube, or via Facebook, or you can email me. My email is michael.wendling, Wendling, @bbc.co.uk.